So, welcome everybody to the second interview of our series on interviewing leaders beyond the States. We are very happy, and I say honored, to have with us today President Trichet. He is very well known to everybody, I'm sure. Very high civil servant in France, governor of the Bank of France, and most notably to all of us in Europe, President of the European Central Bank, and President not in any moment, but in one of the most difficult moments of the history of European integration, and certainly the most challenging moment for the Economic and Monetary Union. I'm sure we are very all interested in learning about your experience, not only during that period, but certainly also during that period. The interview has our model. It's going to be moderated by a journalist, Pierre Biançon, that is the chief Europe economist correspondent for Politico. And we're very happy to have you too, and thank you very much for taking up this role. And he's going to moderate, also to do his own questions, and I'm sure doing some follow-up questions, but he's going to moderate 4 of our researchers, as it is our format, from different nationalities and different departments that I'm sure is going to present a challenge to you. And I just want to briefly present them. And it's Agnieszka Semolensky from the Department of Law. Emmanuel Mollon-Drouot is actually a Gemonet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center. Jonas Hughes Ervik from the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the UI. And Alexandra Foutiot from the Department of Economics. So to the 4 of you too, thank you very much for doing this. And Pierre, you will start and moderate. And President, thank you very much again for accepting to do this.
Thank you for this introduction. And thank you, Mr. Trichet, for being here for what will be, I'm sure, a fascinating exercise, because we have all the time needed to hear your views on both. And I suggest we divide the conversation in 2 parts, basically, which will be one, the lessons you draw from the long financial crisis that Western economies, especially the Eurozone, has experienced, 10 years for the world and a little less than that for the Eurozone. What you think about your actions at the time, and the second part about your views on current developments, on the global economy and what's going on, and a lot, God knows, a lot is going on currently, or is supposed to go on currently in the Eurozone in terms of looking ahead. So we're very grateful for you to have found the time to do this. And I think we'll start right away. Emmanuel, I think we'll start with an opening question. So Emmanuel, the floor is all yours.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, when the crisis hit first in 2007 with BNP Paribas, do you think the ECB was prepared to face the crisis?
Well, in 2007, not only we were prepared to address the crisis which was coming from the subprime and was hitting our monetary market, money market, in the 9th of August 2007, but we were the first central bank to take action immediately. When I say immediately, I mean it, because we took action as a matter of 2 hours and a half. It was the decision to give liquidity to all commercial banks in Europe on an unlimited basis at our rate at the time, which was 4%. So we were asked 95 billion euros. We gave 95 billion euros, and it was the first of this new, I would say, weapon that we had utilized then in the crisis, namely full allotment of liquidity at fixed rate. And I would say the global observers said at the time, I was quite surprised myself, the ECB is coming of age because they had the feeling that we were incapable before to decide rapidly on very, very important, I would say, circumstances.
Well, you hadn't faced a crisis like this before.
No, of course, but I would say no central banks after World War II had to cope with the start of this financial crisis, which proved to be the worst financial crisis since World War II for the advanced economy. So I think we were tested by the circumstances, and I'm happy to say that I considered that our response was appropriate. I was not expecting that a lot of observers would say the ECB exists because I knew that it existed before we were put to the test in question. Of course, the real dramatic heat of the crisis came only after the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, but that period, 2007, since August up to the 15th of September 2008, was a difficult period where we had to cope with turbulent markets.
But in 2007, you said the crisis came from the subprime crisis in the US, which of course everybody recognizes. But it was triggered by the suspension of the quotation of some funds by BNP Paribas. Do you remember your reaction at the time? Did you say, what are these guys doing? What a stupid decision it is?
No, it's much more complicated than that. We had several events that were very, very important, including, of course, the problem of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the action a few days before of the United States. We had quite a lot of major difficulty. There were, I listed 10 events in the United States in America, but also in Europe, which came before and was expecting why we were, I would say, about to take decisions. Quite surprisingly, the BNP Paribas decisions were certainly playing a very important part in the fact that the rest of the world was this 9th of August 2007 tapping our own market and trying to borrow euros to swap them against US dollar because the dollar liquidity problem was generalized. But I had not in mind particularly BNP or any other advanced signal. What I had in mind was that we had no market and that we had to take into account an exceptional situation where we were not at all the master of our own market, because again, the entire world was trying to tap the money market in Europe. New York was closed, so we were the only big, deep, liquid market where you could borrow a currency in order to swap it against dollar.
When you allude to the rapidity, the immediate reaction of the ECB, in such cases, do you decide by yourself or do you consult with 25 members of the Executive Council? Or how fast can you act in such circumstances?
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. The decision was made by the Directorate of the European Central Bank, because it was a question of liquidity, and the Directorate is responsible, the sixth member of the Directorate. And most of us were in vacation. One of us, Mr. Stark, was in Frankfurt, and I was myself in my secondary house in Brittany, and we were communicating by phone, by, at the time, the BlackBerry and so forth, and we took that decision very rapidly. It was a decision which was absolutely necessary in our view, and in my view in particular, because had we let for a full day the market of the European being totally out of order, it would have created, on top of the extraordinary event that would have been observed in Europe, it would have created a drama at a global level. And so we were, of course, very bold, obviously, to supplying liquidity for 95 billion euro was enormously bold. It was, by the way, criticized a little bit by some during 2 or 3 days. After 2 or 3 days, everybody could see that we had clearly a global event, that the subprime had turned to transform a number of risk premia and of spreads in all markets of the world, and nobody was disputing the fact that we took the appropriate decision.
Tell us about another hot day during those times, which was the Lehman Brothers, where the decision of the US government to let Lehman Brothers go. What was your reaction at the time? You must have thought it was not such a great idea.
Well, first of all, it's very good to see what is my own reading of the financial crisis, which I said was the worst since World War II and could have been the worst since World War I, had appropriate decisions not being taken by central banks and by governments at the time. There is a first episode, which I would say an episode of highly turbulent markets, which took place from the 9th of August, because it was really the first moment where we had a very high level of turbulences up to the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers that you mentioned a moment ago. So that was the first episode. Turbulent markets triggered by the subprime. Then we had, I would say, an episode which was grave and immediate threat of total collapse of the financial sphere in the advanced economy. And it goes from, I would say, the Lehman Brothers collapse up to end of 2009, with various difficulties. As I said, threat of total collapse of the financial sphere. Had we let things go, we would have had the drama of a sequence of bankruptcies of first magnitude all over the advanced economies. And then, of course, we could avoid that, but we were still in an episode which I would say it was very, very highly dangerous globally for the advanced economy, with, in the first episode I mentioned, the subprime episode, epicenter in the United States. Second episode since the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, again, epicenter in the United States of America. And then at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010, we had the start of the sovereign risk crisis. And then the epicenter crossed the Atlantic, and we were in Europe at the epicenter of the new episode of the crisis.
Before, I think Jonas has a question on the, especially the Greek, because we started, the thing started in Greece. But before that, what link, do you see the euro crisis as a consequence, really, of the subprime Lehman, the US epicentered crisis? Or it could have happened in any case, right? Or how was it? Or was it magnified? Because the realization of such gap between different Eurozone economies was bound to happen one day or the other, right?
Yeah, as always in such matters, it's a very highly multidimensional situation. It's absolutely clear that had we not had, at a global level, the Lehman Brothers collapse, and that immediate threat of collapse of this financial sphere, countered by immediate action of all central banks of the advanced economy as a matter of days. I was mentioning 2.5 hours for our own decision on the 9th of August. You can say that at the level of the major central banks of the advanced economy, it took 2.5 days to take the first appropriate decision after Lehman Brothers in order to give market participants, institutions, economic agents the world over that there was some kind of crew in the cockpit. And it was the decision we made public on the Thursday morning, simultaneously in all major capitals, that we had a plan, we had a network of swaps agreement between the major central banks in order to ensure appropriate liquidity for the financial institutions.
Agnieszka has a question on the cooperation of central banks.
Thank you. And this is a little bit also bringing in the EU institutional structure, because we all know that at the beginning of the crisis, cooperation between central banks and the establishment of swaps was a key part of policy response at the beginning. But what I wonder is, well, first, how this cooperation developed, because this is not something that existed before, and two, how was this cooperation different between EU central banks, so ECB and Bank of England or Riksbank, and non-EU central banks, so if EU membership makes a difference in cooperation between central banks?
Well, first of all, I would say that the situation of the relationship between central banks was totally different, of course, in that period in comparison, because I made the comparison with 2930s in the 20th century. We are meeting between central banks extremely frequently. In Basel, there are permanent, I would say, encounter of central bank. The communication is instant, immediate between the major central banks. And I have to say that when we are seeing major events globally, we are in close contact immediately. I would say that if I take the example of Bank of England and the Federal Reserve, it was exactly the same pot of information, communication, exchange of views, exchange of as I would say, lucid as possible analysis of the situation. And there was no particular divide. We were in the same basket, in the same boat. We had to cope with a situation where we knew the interlinkages were so, I would say, intense. The interconnectedness between all our markets, all our economies was so intense that there was no time for not exchanging immediate views. And I would say the same for Bank of Sweden. And as you know, the major decisions we took immediately after Lehman Brothers were decisions which were also signed by Bank of Sweden, Bank of Switzerland, of course, Bank of England, and the ECB, the Fed, and Bank of Japan. I would say that had we been in a situation like in 29, where you would have had to go physically, cross the Atlantic, negotiate with the French in the US, or them coming in Europe, we would have been totally lost. The new, I would say, emerging property of finance and the financial sphere today, or the economic sphere today, with technology and globalization, is such that you have to give immediate response to immediate contagion between the various parts of that interconnected system. And we were, in a situation which was totally dramatic, because the kind of contagion we had to cope with was not I would say, understood. Fancy that the United States Treasury, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, was, and I can understand that pretty well, saying in the first half days, we are in a market economy. In a market economy, bad management is punished by bankruptcies. Bankruptcies are fundamental in a market economy, so don't be surprised that there is a bankruptcy. It's normal in a market. We are not in Soviet Union, but at the same time.
Do you agree with that reason?
No,
do
of
you
course.
think?
Of course not, because
So you think it was a wrong decision?
No. I would say it's more complicated again.
It's a yes or no?
No. It's
was it a wrong decision?
Certainly not a yes or no. It was a decision in
if you had been American and had to take the decision on a Friday night, it's a yes or no decision.
No.
Right?
Let me tell you.
If you had been the US Secretary of Treasury.
Let me tell you that life is never that simple.
But you have to make decisions. I agree. But if you're in a spot like yours, of the type of job you have to make the decision on Friday night. Do I let Lehman go or not?
Had I been politically entitled by my own democracy to take the decision to save Lehman Brothers, knowing that the problem was not Lehman Brothers, the problem was the systemic vulnerability of the whole system, knowing that I would have the backing to save the whole system, I would probably have saved Lehman Brothers. But if you let me go, but if I would have been, as was the case in my own understanding of the US executive branch, in a situation where there was no political backing to save the system. Not at all. And I can prove that because when we had, after Lehman Brothers, the start of the collapse of the financial system, that we were containing ourselves, central bankers, but with great difficulty, even with this evidence of the collapse of the system, the Congress of the US refused to vote for the TARP program. So even after Lehman Brothers, there was a confirmation that there was no, I would say, appropriate political backing to take the problem as it were, namely a systemic problem where the system itself was at stake, which called, of course, for a higher level of commitment. And my understanding, again, is that it is only after the political sphere in the US and the public opinion in the US discovered that it was the full economy which was collapsing with the fall like a stone of the Dow Jones and so forth, that there was the capacity to respond. So you see, the problem is quite complicated. My own understanding is that the US executive branch had not the political capacity to do that and to avoid the Lehman Brothers, which was the general wake-up call in the US that something very big was there. So this difference between a single problem and a systemic problem, I could see it also myself in the case of the European sovereign risk crisis. So for me, it was systemic from the very beginning. For a number of observers, it was not a systemic problem, it was only one problem, which was a mistake, obviously.
So we're coming to Greece. And Jonas has a pointed question about Greece and the way the situation was handled from the beginning.
Yeah, so maybe even more generally, I think so far we've been talking about how you handled the first part of the crisis and the extension of liquidity that you talked about. And I think, as you rightly said, there's a consensus now that this was necessary and it was appropriate and it helped calm the markets. But then you moved into another stage where you went from a liquidity to kind of a solvency problem. And my understanding of the ECB's position, and it has been validated, as we know, from some of the letters that were sent to Ireland and to Spain and Italy, that there was like three main principles, and that was no Lehman Brothers in the Eurozone, and the sovereigns will have to recapitalize the banks to prevent the Lehman Brothers, and the sovereigns can't fail themselves, and to avoid sovereigns failing, they have to adopt structural adjustment programs like in Greece or not in Ireland as well for the ELA funding to continue. And so my question is whether this was economically sound, I will leave to the economist, but it seems in hindsight, the political consequence of these decisions is that now you have a Eurozone that is split between creditor and debtor countries, both on an intergovernmental level and also popular opinion within these different countries. So my first question is, do you agree with this analysis? Do you think that these decisions that was made at that time have now made it more difficult for the Eurozone to continue on a path of integration? And was this a trade-off that you were thinking of at the time, or is this something that's only been visible with hindsight? What do you think about that?
The real question, frankly speaking, is not what did you do in the crisis. In the crisis, you have to cope with this situation, which is dramatic. So the real question in the US, how could you manage your own finance in a way, and the financial sphere in a way that you had this systemic vulnerability? And of course, this is part of lessons to be drawn from all that. In the case of Europe, since 2005, the central bank was telling and since 2003, I'm sorry, I have to be, speaking of the central bank, since 2003, we told governments that the Stability and Growth Pact was an essential part of the makeup of the EMU, and to try to weaken the Stability and Growth Pact was an enormous mistake. And it was my first fight in Europe because, I have to say sadly, France, Germany, under the chairmanship of Italy, was starting to weaken the Stability and Growth Pact, taking it as too orthodox, too demanding on the various countries concerned, including France and Germany. So that was, something which, an enormous mistake with the benefit of hindsight. Second, since 2005, that first fight was in 2003, as I said, and my first speech in front of the European Parliament was to defend the Stability and Growth Pact. It was in December 2003. Now, in 2005, I started circulating the charts where you could see the evolution of unit labor cost, of cost competitiveness, of a number of indicators like the wages and salaries in euros of the civil servant in the various countries concerned, and of the imbalances, particularly the current account imbalances. And I was telling since 2005, the Eurogroup, we are looking at that and we see that we have divergences that are systemic divergences, never corrected, persistent divergences in terms of competitiveness, in terms of imbalances, particularly domestic and external. So the mistakes, the main mistakes, were made when, I would say, at a national level and at a collegial level, this kind of persistent vulnerabilities were left uncorrected.
Can we pause just a second?
Then we had the crisis.
Just a second, on the Chirac, on the France-Germany, because you won't name names, will you? Yeah. On the France and Germany asking for a suspension, basically, of the Stability and Growth Pact. Germany used that fiscal leeway to implement structural reforms, which became known as the Hartz reforms. France did nothing. So there's a difference there between giving yourself some space to implement reforms, because structural reforms do cost money, even though the ECB doesn't acknowledge it. They cost, they make the deficit worse in the short term, while another country chose to do nothing. So in a way, there are good and bad ways to suspend or to make the Stability and Growth Pact flexible.
Yeah,
no?
Well, there are other different, you're absolutely right. The structural reforms were absolutely fundamental in Germany, and were not made in. No, it's not true. They could have done that. They didn't need the suspension of the pact, which, by the way, has been a very bad example given to all other countries. And in the case of Germany, the spontaneous, I would say, consensus amongst social partners in particular was such that in any case, Germany was improving year after year its cost competitiveness, even in the absence of structural reforms. We were in presence of a society which was fully aware of the absolute necessity to regain competitiveness in order to fight against unemployment. It was not the case in many other countries in Europe, unfortunately. Such a consensus did not exist. But you're right, structural reforms were instrumental. But to say we did we weakened the pact in order to make the structural reforms, I don't buy that. I think that Germany could have had exactly the same success, and I think it's a pity, with retrospect, that the bad example was given by the most important country and countries.
To follow up on Jonas's question, while you were saying that to governments, you were showing your graphs, and I remember throughout the years you always came to journalists, politicians, you had those graphs, so I can testify to that for years and years and years. While you were saying that to governments, how come bond markets didn't notice? How come they kept lending? Where was the so-called markets discipline throughout those years?
No, as everybody knows, there was no market discipline, clearly, and we could not rely upon market discipline.
Markets don't work? Investors are stupid?
Market have a tendency to respond by yes and no, as you know. It's some kind of bit. Either it's 0 or it's 1. And we have to know that. It is the reason why we had a Stability and Growth Pact, and we are not relying on that particular point only on markets, and rightly so. Unfortunately, the Stability and Growth Pact was not respected as it should have been respected. Another lack, I would say, of appropriate governance and pillar of governance in Europe was precisely the fact that there was no pillar that would give the Commission the responsibility of looking at these cost competitiveness issues, those sustained divergences I was mentioning. And it's a pity. The idea there was not we rely entirely on the market, it was also we rely on the common sense of the countries concerned. If they are losing competitiveness, they will at a time have a level of unemployment which would be unsustainable. But experience has demonstrated, and it was one of the lessons of the crisis, that we had to rely upon a solid governance, economic, financial, and budgetary governance at the heart of the EMU, if we wanted the system to hold as well as possible. We know that now, and I respond with some delay to one of your questions. Had we not had the financial crisis with epicenter in the US, had we had to observe a problem in Europe? I think so. It would have been later, probably, because the, I would say, global markets were activated by the crisis in the US. The first signs we had that maybe we would have at a certain moment a real issue with sovereign risk came without particular, I would say, attention on Europe. I have the memory of downrating of the US signature itself, of a number of articles in the various financial media, according to which experience had demonstrated that you could not give any particular signature any privilege. It had been observed in the private sector, could be observed in the public sector. Even I have the memory of some eloquent speakers saying, I don't invest anymore in US treasuries because I'm not sure that it will be such a good, I would say, investment. So we could see that the question was asked by a large number of market participants, can we trust the public signature? When at the very beginning of the crisis, the public signature were undisputable, and it was the private signature which were at stake. The problem of the European is that when clearly the global market turned on the public signature, they considered that the most vulnerable public signature were in Europe and in the euro area in particular.
Is it why you held firm against any form of, again, I'm jumping on your last question, of debt restructuring in the Eurozone? Because those creditors lend foolishly, as you explained, to those countries for years, yet at the end, you chose to make them whole.
I mean, again, we had before the experience of Lehman Brothers. And the decision, and it was a right decision in my own understanding at the time, was, as you said, we had one Lehman Brothers, we should not have two Lehman Brothers. Not particularly in Europe, anywhere in the world. And in the US, there was not a second systemic institution collapsing, at least during the time of the crisis, of course. And the same in Europe, where it would have had exactly the same impact. That's the reason why all governments, after the central bank did what they could, all governments took the very, very important decision to combat the crisis, and it was the case in the UK as well as in the euro area everywhere. In the case of the sovereign risk, we could see why we were the most vulnerable. I am speaking under control here. One particular country, which is not the only one. The first batch of countries with problems were Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. Not one country, three countries. And where we decided to do the extraordinary move to purchase treasuries of these countries, it was the three countries that were at stake, and the three countries' treasuries that we purchased. So, but to take one of these countries, the most vulnerable, Greece, current account deficit, 15% of the GDP at the beginning of the drama of the crisis. Budget deficit, 15% of the GDP. You know, the system, for a number of reasons, had permitted that we could have such a dramatic situation. But again, the problem was not Greece. The problem was, as we could see when time elapsed, Ireland, Portugal, and even Spain and Italy at the time. We had also to purchase, as you know, treasuries from Italy and Spain in a very dramatic episode in 2011. So my own understanding was we have to apply what we have applied the world over in such circumstances. Your first best is to restore the creditworthiness of the entity concerned. Restore the creditworthiness. If you succeed in restoring the creditworthiness of the entity concerned...
You can't do that by restructuring it instead.
I mean, in the case of the Asian crisis, only one country had to go through the major difficulty of major restructuring and loss of money, big losses of money by the creditors. Only one, Indonesia, not the others. Again, the working assumption is always you try to restore creditworthiness. You can succeed, you can lose. If you lose, you have to take into account the situation as it is. But if you succeed, you succeed. In our case, we lost in the case of Greece. We succeeded in the case of all others. If we had started to have a generalized, I would say, loss of confidence, we would have taken ourselves the loss of confidence all over. And we would have done what we had avoided in the private sector signature, namely to have a large sequence of drama. Where could we have been if everybody is losing its own creditworthiness? You have to appreciate yourself, but I appreciated myself the situation as being very grave. On top of that, to explain you why I was sticking to this idea, which after all permitted all of us to observe what we have today, namely resilience of the euro area, which has been absolutely remarkable, and I could go back to that if you wish in one of your questions. Yeah. But I would certainly appreciate to have the occasion of mentioning this solidity and resilience of the euro area. But in the case of this sovereign risk crisis, at the time I had to combat an idea which was devastating. In May 10, we decided together, governments with their own responsibility, and they were very difficult to cope with, enormously difficult to cope with politically for all countries concerned. But also the central bank had taken extraordinarily dramatic situation because, as I said, we embark on purchasing treasuries of a number of countries. And the communication of the European at the time, in all the communique we were making at the level of Europe, at the level of the G7, at the level of the G20, so globally, was we are there, you can trust the European signature, we are there and we are backing our own system. Now, at a certain moment, a new event came, which is the Deauville Agreement. And the Deauville Agreement was saying private sector involvement.
The Deauville Agreement, we should explain, it was a deal, a beachside deal between Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy that future debt in the Eurozone could be potentially restructured.
Yeah.
The stock of debt was left
not only could be,
idea.
Could be, because could be was always possible. Again, in my own concept, if you lose the battle to regain creditworthiness, you have to accept that, of course. But it was worse than that. It has to be, because we must take, if there is a call for help coming from any particular country to the friends, the other European countries, or possibly to the IMF, then we must care for the private sector to take the appropriate hit, either in the form of a loss of capital, of principal, or of a large restructuring or whatever. And I can understand that, seen from a particular, I would say, MP in any National Assembly, in any country. It looks fair. You are asking for taxpayer risk, possibly taxpayer money, and it's normal to ask the private sector to step in. But one has to understand the functioning of markets. Markets are made of those who are long and those who are short, and you know that better than anybody. If you take a hit on those who are long, very good, they are losing money. But those who are short, namely the pure speculators, are making money. They are exactly in the mathematical reverse situation. Those who are long are losing money, those who are short are making money. So you are telling speculators, oh, you can go, because if you succeed in putting the country on its feet, then it asks for help, then you will make money. Because, again, we have this private sector involvement, which is only targeting, of course, those who are long. So the concept, the right concept, and I'm back to what I said, is what happened, for instance, in Asia, and the normal concept in such situation is we will have private sector involvement because the ultimate goal is to have creditworthiness, and when a country gets back to creditworthiness, the private money is happy to step in. It is now what we are observing in all European countries. In all European countries, you have access to market by the various countries concerned, and the private sector is helping by definition because there is the appropriate level of creditworthiness. So I was in the situation which was very, very difficult, obviously, to tell governments, because it was not only two governments, as you said, it was all the governments that accepted that. I said that it was a mistake, seen in my own perspective, which was the systemic defense of Europe in the European Council concern. Then, of course, we had to cope with the drama of Greece, which is the only failure that we had in terms of path back to creditworthiness. And of course, I myself was realistic, but I told the governments, now you have to change your rhetoric. The private sector involvement is applied to Greece, as we could all see, not to any other country, full stop. And there was the commitment of the governments to confirm that, which, in my opinion, has been decisive progressively to get the euro area back to the present situation.
We're almost near that part where we're going to move into current developments and what happens, your views on the resilience of the Eurozone, the dangers, potential dangers, and what remains to be done. I want to just, not asking you for yes or no answers, but asking you whether throughout those times, incredible historical crises, tough decisions to make, sometimes in a hurry, is there anyone that, with hindsight, which is always easier, of course, you would have made differently?
Well,
I have a few questions specific, which
yeah,
I will ask you.
I understand that. You always have to know that taking a decision in dramatic circumstances, you are never sure that it is the best decision possible, because only, the future events will tell you whether or not it was the appropriate decision. And finally, the problem is, did you succeed, or was it a dramatic failure? Was there a dramatic failure, taking into account your ultimate goal? And I mean, we had extraordinarily difficult decision to take in August 2007, in May 2010, in July and August 2011, in terms of absolute non-standard measures, if I may. And that, of course, was something which, taking into account what we have observed since then, I cannot say that it is proof that these were bad decisions. But they were very highly criticized, as you know, in many circles.
While you were in many ways laying the groundwork of a more accommodative monetary policy, as soon as 2011, you raised interest rates twice in the first half of that year. There were then lowered twice in the second part of the year when you successful.
Yeah.
Do you regret those interest rates hikes? Or maybe the second one?
No, because
even the second one?
my understanding at the time, first of all, we were in totally different situation where inflation was high, and when we were fearing some kind of, it might appear paradoxical now, but at the time, the rhetoric of the social partners were totally different because we had a high level of nominal prices. We were close to 3% in inflation. And so there was the start of a loss of, I would say, trust in the stability of the currency, stability of the prices. And my own understanding is that, on the one hand, I was absolutely obliged to do things that were totally against the sentiment of a large number of people, even a majority of some public opinion. Clearly, a majority of some public opinion were horrified by what we were doing, in particular in terms of touching the treasuries and more or less indirectly touching the budget sphere, the fiscal sphere. On the other hand, it was absolutely essential that the trust in the stability of the currency and the stability of the prices would remain intact. So I was giving simultaneously, and I knew that, and when I say I mean the entire, I would say, governing council and all of us, we were giving simultaneously those two signals. You can trust us. We know that our mandate is to have a stable currency. That currency is stable, has proved to be stable, will remain stable. Don't trust for a minute that because we are massively purchasing treasuries, we are putting into question the solidity, the creditworthiness of the currency. And it was really this kind of appreciation. We are not at all on top of that, I have to say. The comparison is always made with the US. The US is a single economy. We were not a single economy. We were an economy where the interest rates were not transmitted to, I would say, approximately starting with 10, then 20, then 37% of the GDP of the euro area. When we had the crisis in 11, and again, you can imagine what was the reaction of some in Europe when I started purchase with my colleagues the treasuries of Spain and Italy together. You can imagine what it represented.
Well, we remember
they were convinced that it would mean a drama as regards inflation. And you know that pretty well because the articles were very eloquent, the editorial were very eloquent. So again, I took it that we were gaining much more in diminishing the spreads that were appearing in 40% of the GDP of the euro area, and by the way, reinforcing the sentiment that we remain faithful to our mandate, than in behaving like in the US, because we are not the United States of America, not at all.
So we move now to I'd call it the contemporary period, which is the way, but after a new president took over at the ECB, and Alexandria has a question to start that part of the discussion.
Yes, let me move a bit in the EMU of the future. And it seems that the crisis revealed some weaknesses of the original architecture of the EMU. Steps were taken to improve and fix those, but many believe that we are still vulnerable in shocks, and to make more sustainable the EMU, a fiscal union is needed. And this is something that you also pointed out several times, for example, in your speech when you received the Karls Prize in 2011, that we have a strong M in the EMU from the ECB and the Eurosystem, but we need to develop more the economic union, they in the EMU. So in your opinion, which would be a viable institutional framework of a fiscal union for a sustainable EMU? Which should be the priorities towards this direction for a common fiscal policy? And how would you think the effect of monetary policy would change on the macroeconomy in the presence of a potential fiscal union?
Yeah, well, it's an immense question. First, if we had a sovereign risk crisis, it was before. First, we did not respect the Stability and Growth Pact. Second, we did not correct the persistent imbalances that were very visible. And third, it's also an important part, we had no banking union. So there were, in my understanding, three weaknesses. One, we were the author of that weaknesses. The second one, it was, partly absence of lucidity of the author of EMU, and partly absence of lucidity of all institutions concerned, because, again, the things were there, very visible, persistent imbalances, and growing persistent imbalances. And banking union was something which was more or less discovered as a crucial part of EMU in the time of the crisis, because we could see the correlation, the 100% correlation between the creditworthiness of the states and the creditworthiness of their banks, because the states were called to be more or less the backstop of the banks, and of course it created this high level of correlation in all advanced economy, not only in Europe. So first call, and it was very clear, I hope, in my speech in Aachen, respect the Stability and Growth Pact. Respect the absolute necessity to control cost competitiveness and competitiveness in general and imbalances in the euro area. Have a Minister of Finance of the euro area to be responsible for that, to be responsible for the governance, the economic, financial, and budgetary fiscal governance of the euro area. And on top of that, of course, you have the things that you can do on top of that. But the first thing to do now that we have a Stability and Growth Pact, which has been, by the way, reinforced, even if it is still heavily criticized, not only by the European, but globally, it's not very popular, the Stability and Growth Pact. When I am in the United States of America, it's not popular. It's considered more or less a tight jacket, because it's very difficult to understand to which extent the euro area is special, totally different from the United States of America, even if we hope that we will be.
On that topic, are there two different discussions on whether the Stability and Growth Pact is good in general, in normal times, when things run normally and smoothly, and then they have to be respected, but the case that can be made against the Eurozone, and that was before, because in part of the strong pressure of the ECB on governments, was that it was, in this case, contracyclical and applied at the wrong moment, forcing country to tighten fiscally just as a big recession was hitting. So is it better, and now the Stability and Growth Pact is criticized because the rules are very strict, German culture, and not respected. So is it better to have very strict rules that are regularly violated, or more flexible rules that could be respected?
We have a,
but the contra-cyclical thing to begin with.
I respond to all your points. I am in agreement with some, but in strong disagreements with others. First of all, it's not the German culture. The 3% was introduced in the French delegation in the Maastricht negotiation. The German had another concept, which was the golden rule. So the French have forgotten that, but the 3% were the French rule after 82, 83. So one has to remember that. Second, we were in a situation of crisis in a number of sovereigns. They had to regain creditworthiness. They had to regain, at least if one accepts the idea that we had a systemic problem and we had to try to solve our systemic problem without a sequence of drama. I already explained that. Then, of course, what was absolutely decisive was to have the help of the international community, the help of the other European, and the help of the central bank, which was given to those countries. The countries were backed for reasons that were monetary reasons by the central bank, trying to help improve the transmission of its monetary policy in countries where spreads were gigantic. Second, the other Europeans, the taxpayers, accepted to contribute to the redressment, to the recovery of those countries. And third, the international community was mobilized also in a number of cases. Who would have financed, on top of that, a less, I would say, orthodox fiscal policy? It's your theory. I mean, it didn't fit with the situation where we were. Those who are saying that are consolidating Europe, comparing to the US, and saying they did not behave like the US. Of course we did not behave like the US. There was no drama in the US at the time for 40% of the GDP of the United States of America. So I think really it is easy to say you should have been more demanding, less demanding, but who is the philanthropic institution which would have permitted to be less demanding in the circumstances?
Well,
so
Jonas wants to jump on this?
Well, couldn't you kind of say that the bond markets took that role? Isn't that the problem? So to me, it seems you talk a lot about the SGP, and it's about deficits and debt. And as like implicitly, if you have too much of either, you're not going to be creditworthy. But isn't that supposed to be the bondholder's decision, and that's what the yield is supposed to represent in part, is the credit risk of lending to a specific government. So to me, it seems like you had the SGP, nobody cared about it, and then the private markets lent without any, and yields converge, which is the point that Pierre made. And now you're kind of saying that we have to make the SGP even stronger, but if the bond markets are going to keep treating Eurozone sovereigns as having the same credit risk, won't you run into the same problem again in the future?
But you have accepted the fact that markets were not a very vigilant partner, okay?
Yeah.
So if markets are not a very vigilant partner, we have to know that they would be either benevolent or aggressive. Then we have to rely upon governance. And it is an additional argument to say we need a solid, serious, not ultra-orthodox, of course, a governance which would be the appropriate one. But going back to a comparison with the United States of America, you have to know that in the US, the fiscal transfer are not representing the most important channel to help a particular state which would have an asymmetric shock. The financial union plays a much more important role because risks are diversified all over the United States, and if a particular state has problems, he's getting more credit coming from the financial system as a whole. And to the extent that, as you know, in the United States, 70% of the financing of the economy comes through markets. So we have a very, very important channel, and that's the reason why I think it's extremely important to have a good banking union functioning in Europe, and also a market union solidly functioning, because it is the experience of the US shows that it's very, very important, again, to smoothen the absorption of the various shocks asymmetric shocks that you could have.
So we're going to come to your view on what has been done since then, and we'll start from the beginning by a simple question, which is in the summer of 2012, your successor uttered the famous whatever it takes expression. Is that something that conceptually you could have said yourself at some point? And at the moment he said it?
When I purchased the Greek treasuries, it was something of that dimension, because you only read the editorial in many countries which were considering that it was absolutely dramatic. But the market took that, the ECB was there. And not only for Greece, but for Ireland and Portugal, as you know. When we purchased treasuries of Spain and Italy, these were decisions which were taken very rapidly because a dramatic crisis was unfolding. And my understanding is that when a dramatic crisis is unfolding, you have to act as soon as possible in order to not to let, I would say,
I'm talking about the statement, the formula. Is it something that you think a central banker should say?
Well, he said whatever it takes within the limit of our mandate. So one forgets my understanding is that that message was understood as the following. You thought that the S&P, namely the purchases that we operate in my time, are now out and could not be imagined, which was more or less what the market trusted at the time, because the S&P was not continued, and because we had a period of euphoria which was associated with the long-term, 3 years refinancing that had what was an enormous operation which created an overall sentiment of, I would say, protection for Europe. So the market had understood that at the time there was euphoria. But then the euphoria dissipated. And this idea, in any case, it is impossible that they would do again what they did with Greece, Spain, and Italy, was in the market. And I could see that myself discussing with US friends. New York was convinced that you could speculate against the European and make money out of this speculation because the central bank could not intervene anymore.
So it was the right statement.
On top of that, yes, of course, it was the right statement. On top of that, we had, in my time, I had a commitment of the governments that through the ESM, they could intervene on the secondary market, which was explaining why the ECB was more or less, prudent. Because there was still a commitment of the governments that it was maybe up to them to intervene on the secondary market. Now it appeared very, very clearly that contrary to what they had envisaged in July and August 2011, they would not do that. And so, again, the central bank was absolutely right, of course, to say, we are there. We are still there, as we were in the past, and you can count on our own action. Don't trust that you will make money in speculating without any particular
to cut the speculation, to stop it.
Yeah.
Aniska, you had a question.
If I could just maybe a little bit build on the question, because I think it's important that you highlighted the additional words that Draghi said, which is within our mandate, not his personal mandate, obviously.
But he had also added, and believe me, it will be enough. Remember, he had led to that.
Within
our mandate, exactly. And the question, and this is something that at the EUI actually we are exploring quite a bit in the law department, looking at the mandate of the ECB and the accountability as well. Do you think the mandate has changed? Maybe not formally, obviously, but ECB's understanding of its own mandate. So, for example, understanding what financial stability is, and also the place of the ECB within the overall institutional framework of the EU. So relationship of the ECB towards other EU institutions, the European Parliament in particular, but also national parliaments, for example, if you think about Irish Parliament. Do you think that it's not the mandate that has changed, but the kind of the place of the institution within the overall framework which has changed, which maybe would have allowed Draghi to say those words in 2011, and at the beginning of the crisis it wouldn't have been possible?
Well, first of all, I take it that all the decisions which were taken by the ECB, at least the exceptional decisions targeting particular countries, particular signature, were done because the ECB is not the institution which says country X is in the European single currency area, country B is in the European currency area. As long as the governments themselves are saying we are in the European single currency area, and these are the countries which are in, it is the responsibility of the central bank to help transmit its own monetary policy decided in Frankfurt by the Council of Governors to the various countries concerned. This is the responsibility of the ECB. And it is the reason why we intervened in particular countries directly through the SMP operation, which I already mentioned in 5 countries, and with the OMT, which was, again, also targeted by construction. So that is very important, has to be understood. We are a particular institution with monetary responsibility in a situation which is very peculiar, obviously. Now, all central banks in the world had to cope with, in the advanced economy, had to cope with new challenges of financial instability and, of course, by way of consequence of economic instability. And the question is open everywhere in the world on what do you do then? And do you change more or less the mandate of the central bank? The mandate of the central bank as regards price stability, in my understanding, is not to be changed. It would be extremely dangerous to touch that mandate. You can say, of course, always, if there are financial instability which are growing, it will create either a deflationary threat, and this is not price stability, or an inflationary threat, and this is not price stability. If it is imbalances on the side of governments with too much, I would say, debt outstanding, public debt outstanding, it is likely that it would create an inflationary shock. If it is on the side of the private sector, the deflationary shock might occur. So it's a very, very complex situation. We already always said in the ECB, and it is the policy of the ECB, we look not only at the economic analysis, therefore at our provision for the projection of inflation in the years to come on a medium-term basis, we are also looking at the counterpart of monetary aggregates, namely also the dynamics of debt outstanding, public and private. And that was the privilege of the central bank, highly criticized by many, I would say, in the universities and by academia, until we had the crisis. With the crisis, nobody is really challenging that having a look at the dynamics of credit, public and private, is very important, remains very important. And for me, it's part of perhaps the pride of the ECB that we were not totally out of order when we were told your two pillars are not working, there is only one pillar, because that very one pillar proved to be misleading. I don't take it that we were much better than the others, but at least intellectually, it was not a mistake to look at the dynamics of credit.
Still on the mandate, but a slightly different question. The 2% goal below but close, which was set by the ECB itself, why should it remain the same eternally? Why shouldn't the ECB, and there are a lot of questions about whether it's the appropriate inflation target in the current day's economy because of macroeconomic trends. Why shouldn't the ECB review it from time to time? I understand the credibility question, it can't change every month, but why shouldn't it say, okay, our target now will be either 1.5% or 4%, because we have two schools basically now.
Yeah, as you said, I could experience myself the school which was suggesting that 4% would be much better.
The Blanchard school.
And then I could see a school saying, you are doing extraordinary efforts, it is nothing, stupid, let's be at zero and you should be satisfied with zero and so forth.
But why not review it every other year?
Academia is looking at it, it's perfect, it's very important, we must have permanent discussion.
Stanley Fischer from the Fed suggested that every 2 years, for example, a committee reviews and says, but there's a periodic...
I am in total disagreement with this, because again, central banks are in very turbulent periods supposed to be major anchor of stability. And we are reasoning medium and long term. We are trying to anchor in the best fashion possible our own inflation expectations on a 5 years basis. And you know, one of the indicators which is important is the forward 5 years. So what will be the inflation in 5 years' time during the following 5 years. So we are necessarily reasoning, like the markets, on a longer term basis, and we should not, in my opinion, introduce additional turbulences, also looking at the volatility of the recommendation that we receive. So I think it's very important that there are permanent meditation, and the world is changing, obviously. That being said, let me insist on something which I trust very important. I call that conceptual convergence of the central banks of the advanced economy. We were divided as regards banking surveillance. Now we have more or less a consensus on the fact that banking surveillance, very close to the central bank, in the UK, in the US, in Europe it is extremely close to the central bank, is something which is appropriate. It came out of the lesson of the crisis. It is an implicit convergence, if I may, which has not been premeditated, but is there. Second convergence, this idea that we have special responsibility as regards prevention of systemic risks. And the central banks on both sides of the Atlantic have been introduced in the systemic risk prevention in Europe with the presidency of the European Systemic Risk Board by the ECB president. We had also convergence, I don't insist on that, on communication, considering that communicating frequently, directly through press conferences with the public opinion was necessary. I think it's also a consequence of the crisis, and it's something which academia could work on because it's really something which came out of the crisis. Now the 2%. All central banks of the advanced economies that are issuing currencies that are in the basket of the SDR, I'm not speaking of China, I'm speaking of Japan, UK, the US, and the Euro area, we all have now reference to the 2%. So you see to which extent there is an enormous difference between the normal meditation of academia, whether 4% is not better than 2 or 0% better than 2 or whatever, and the fact that in the crisis, because it's a phenomenon which was observed in the UK and in the euro area, but came in the crisis in 12 and 13 in the US and in Japan. Again, all currencies of the advanced economy that are issued by, again, the major economies have the same reference, not exactly the same, 2% as the target of inflation targeting, or 2% as an appropriate reference, like in Japan and the US, or as we say, less than 2 but close to 2, which means everybody understands 1.8, 1.9. So that is something which I draw your attention to. Conceptual convergence inside the constituency of major central banks of the advanced economy is a fantastic phenomenon which is under-assessed, in my opinion, underestimated by academia. And I draw your attention.
Can I ask a question about it?
Please.
Yeah. So to what extent do you think that this convergence is about an actual development of a best policy response? And to what extent is it a consequence of the limiting the kind of the straitjacket of international finance, meaning that if a large group of issuing currencies agree on 2% or a similar target, it's very difficult to move away from it because then you will face capital flight. Do you see that?
No, I'm not sure because as you see, Stan Fischer was saying we should review that. Each particular economy, country, institution concerned, because in all those cases, apart from the UK, where the government is taking a role in giving the target, but in all other cases, it is in the hands of the central bank. So let me say that I take it as some kind of sentiment in each particular economy that we have to again provide as much stability as we can in a universe which is potentially extraordinarily turbulent. But we have other reasons to have perhaps capital, I would say, going from here to there, the interest rates level, because the 2% doesn't mean that we have, as you of course know, the same interest rate level, the growth potential on the medium and long term. I mean, you have a large number of other dimensions that could explain the capital moves. but fundamentally, it seems to me that it is the convergence of all of us to think it is our responsibility to stabilize as much as possible expectations in domains where our own franchise is indisputable. And
we're going to take questions from the audience shortly. Just before that, I'd like to know whether, do you like what you hear about the plans, projects, ideas on Eurozone reform? The consensus vaguely seems to be that we're going to do first the banking union, you talked about that. Then we're going to modify, reform the European Stability Mechanism and make it a European Monetary Fund. And then maybe the questions might, or the debates, traditional debates between France and Germany might become more difficult. The idea that are bandied about, do you approve of them? Do you think it would be a good idea first to transform the ESM into a kind of fund that could also intervene in case of asymmetric shock? And do you think, we're going to talk about restructuring again, that resorting to the ESM, EMF would mean automatic restructuring of the debt, which is, you know, has been a red line for the French government as it seems.
But that is an enormous mistake.
That would be a mistake.
Nothing to do with the French government or with any particular government. It's absence of understanding what is the present financial sphere.
No automatic restructuring.
And
we understand.
no, the ESM, I'm in favor of the ESM transformation, provided it is the IMF concept. Mm-hmm. Namely, we have a first goal in all cases, which is to rebuild creditworthiness. If we are in a situation where it is impossible to rebuild creditworthiness, okay, we accept that it didn't work. But to make it compulsory is an enormous mistake. Okay. And I have to say that very, very clearly, because it comes back and back and back. And I understand why it comes back, because it's simpler to explain to part of the political sphere in any country. Also in my own country, I think that the National Assembly would buy that because it looks normal. And again, it's difficult to understand why it would be an enormous mistake.
We understand.
But that being said, to respond to your question, I am, of course, in favor of applying strictly what we have already to achieve the banking union, which is extremely important, to achieve the capital market union, which is extremely important, as I said, in the case of the US, to proceed with the ESM with the appropriate concept, of course, and I explained that. And I am in favor, theoretically, but it has to be, of course, seen very practically, how to have some kind of fund that would not be a transfer fund in any respect. I think that this is not sellable, and it would not be a good idea, but a fund which would, you know, have money coming in when we are in a very good episode of the cycle at the level of the euro area as a whole, and then would help in case we have the downward episode of the cycle. That would be a stability, not for individual countries, no, at the level of the euro area as a whole. For the individual countries, we have the strict respect, in my opinion, of the Stability and Growth Pact, which gives you, in any case, normally 3% of cartridges to fire, to have the US metaphor, if you are in a difficult situation nationally. Then you have the possible help which is given by other countries. And of course, we'll see exactly what to do in such circumstances. But I would not be in favor of automatic transfer, which would more or less turn out to be subsiding of countries that are poorly managed by countries that are well managed. And it seems to me that it is unsellable.
Don't you think, I mean, it has been an old thing in the euro area that surplus countries are perceived as being virtuous and don't have to make any effort in terms of internal imbalance or even current account imbalance to restore in a way. Don't you think it's time for surplus countries to make their own effort a little bit?
It is already done. The MIP, the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, has been decided upon in the crisis, with the lesson of the crisis. It is something which, in my opinion, a pillar of governance which is as important as the Stability and Growth Pact, calls for correcting persistent imbalances, and it is supposed to be symmetric. It's clear that it is absolutely abnormal to run 15% to 10% of current account deficit. It is not normal to have a permanent 8.5% excess of your own current account. And clearly, it is something that is in the hands of the governance of the euro area as a whole. The MIP is supposed to be symmetric. And
so we go to the audience. You grab the microphone and you ask your questions. Nathan.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Trichet. You say that you would support a strengthening of the role of the ESM. What role would that leave to the Commission, and notably DG ECFIN and the staff of the ECB, which has been playing this role of monitoring the macroeconomic situation, designing adjustment programs together with the IMF? If you strengthen the ESM, doesn't that reflect also sometimes a bit of a lack of trust of some key member states, some creditor countries, in the role that the Commission is playing? Thank you.
No, I accept that this is something which is a very important issue. It's clear that at the very beginning of the crisis, the fact that the Commission was not experienced in managing such crisis, and that the IMF was, explained all the discussion we had on whether or not the European would take full responsibility for all that.
If I can explicit the discussions we had, which you mentioned,
Yeah.
you were strongly against involving the IMF in the Eurozone crisis.
Yeah, well,
you said so at the time.
Yeah, because
you fought against the involvement of the IMF, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, again.
Do you think, with hindsight, do you think
things are always more complicated?
Yeah.
I was
yes or no again.
I was fighting against the theory, which was a very strong theory in some countries, that first, Europe had nothing to do with countries in difficulty, that there was no money for them, and there was no responsibility to take in the adjustment, in the conditionality. And therefore, that even at the heart of the euro area, only the IMF was in charge. And I was in very good company at the time, because it was the first reaction of Minister Schäuble. Minister Schäuble said, it's a European problem, we have to take responsibility as European. It was exactly my own position. And I could say to governments, I told you since 2005 that we would have problems. And now we are at the beginning of 10 or in 10. So take your responsibility. But that being said, I was in favor of the deal. And the deal, as you know, was shared responsibility as regards conditionality with the IMF, shared responsibility as regards the help given. The first concept was 2/3 for the European, 1/3 for the IMF. And I fully accepted, of course, that the ECB would be part of what was called, I would say, the Troika. It was not really the Troika, because the ECB had no responsibility. The ECB was there as an observer, but the responsibility was taken by the European, on the one hand, the European Council of the Eurogroup, and by the IMF board, on the other hand. In both cases, these were the decision-making processes. But again, to go back to what you said, it seems to me that in any case, the financial technostructure is clearly in the ESM, and the economic technostructure today is in the Commission. So how do you merge the two to create a powerful technostructure that would be specialized in this kind of... and in my opinion, it would be such an essential part of the governance of the euro area, with this kind of competence, that I would say in my own future EMU as I see it, where you have a Minister of Finance of EMU, he would have an enormous responsibility to run both, I would say, banking union to the extent that there are governmental responsibilities at the level of Europe, the Stability and Growth Pact, the PMI, the MIP, I'm sorry, the pillar of monitoring competitiveness that I mentioned, and of course also this particular body which would have to report more or less to a political entity at a certain moment, of course, and I guess that this would be a very solid framework for EMU, frankly speaking.
Next question, sir.
If you don't mind, I have there are three very small questions. One is, there is a tradition with central bankers to write their memories. Do you have the intention to write memories? And in this case, what would you write about your statement on the Danish vote in 2003 about the refusal of the euro, in this case?
I'm sorry, in my own memory?
Yes.
What I would write on the Danish decision not to come?
Yeah. If you will.
I will tell you.
The second question is, just because I didn't understand very well, but it's just a sort of joke in the sense, but a serious one. If Lehman Brothers was called Lehman Frère or Lehman Brüder, do you think that the European banking culture would have give this bank a different destiny instead of course, what happened in US? And the third one is about, let's say, the understanding of the origins of the crisis. Listening to you, and what I read on that is, everything at the level of central banks seems quite clear from the very beginning. But maybe you remember that one of the first meetings of the financial minister of European Union, the German finance minister said, the crisis has an origin in US, and the US must find a solution. Did the central bankers, European central bankers, particularly you and the other member of the directorate, explain the financial ministers, European financial minister, that the explanation and the solution of crisis must be different?
First question, Denmark. I would say Denmark was one of the two countries with opt-out clause. We have been always extremely close to Denmark, before the euro, after the euro. The fact that Denmark was following a monetary policy that was very, very nicely shadowing the euro, and our relationship were as close as possible, I would say, would drive me to say, well, it's a pity. I understand that it's an additional demonstration of the fact that the public opinion in Denmark remains very keen on being very close to Europe, but not necessarily at the heart of Europe, which I would have associated more or less with the special legislation on preventing foreigners for purchasing secondary house in Denmark and so forth and so forth. But I would not have considered that as a drama to the extent that de facto Denmark was a member of the euro area, de facto. So I was certainly not dramatizing that. Very often in my conversation with foreigners, I was saying, all countries in the European Union are potentially members of the euro area. I don't say that they should get in immediately or even within a long period of time, but they are entitled to enter. There are only two countries which have an opt-out clause, the UK and Denmark, but Denmark is already in de facto. As regards Lehman Brothers, had Lehman Brothers been called Lehman Frère, as Lazare was Lazare Frère in New York, I don't think it would have changed anything, frankly speaking. And in all cases, the problem was, do you have the immediate political capacity to mobilize massively public risk, taxpayer risk, or taxpayer money in the circumstances. And I take it that it would have been exactly the same anywhere, including in Europe, because I have the memory of my very long talks with a number of governments to tell them, I'm very sorry, we already experienced that in the United States of America. Look at what has been done then afterwards in the US, in the UK, in many countries. Please, Belgian government, be aware, because I was in the Belgian government to explain what was the situation and why. And I had a number of phone calls with many, many governments in telling them, in my opinion, of course, you do whatever you want and you do whatever your own democracy permits. But let me tell you that my own sentiment is that a new such systemic financial catastrophe would trigger enormous consequences. Now, you had a third question, again on Lehman? On...
Yeah, the third question is about the different understanding of the crisis and political, financial minister of European Union.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it was the general sentiment was, of course, the US were clumsy enough to let the subprime creating the trigger for a dramatic financial crisis. And it was not untrue to say, stop the carnival in Wall Street, take into account all the consequences. The TARP agreement, which was $1 trillion operation with public money, public risk, was something which was, you could say, well, it is the proof that telling the US you have to step in was not absurd. But that being said, of course, the contagion was quasi-immediate. So we were immediately polluted, as were the other private signature in the US. In Europe, we were polluted in the same fashion by this drama. And so it was very, very clear that we all had to step in, exactly like the central bank had, negotiated together and taken in a very short span of time the appropriate decision. But fancy how difficult it is to get on the same wording the approval of the Open Market Committee, the approval of the Governing Council of the ECB, and so forth. It was the same with the governments. So they were plunged in turbulences which were so interconnected that it was obvious. But I can understand that at the very beginning, the idea was, well, the whole model of markets, Wall Street, proved a level of vulnerability which was not expected at all, of course. But again, we are all in the same basket, clear.
Sir?
Thank you. Let me just tag along with a memoir book suggestion by suggesting a title. It's more complicated than that. I think it will work very well. But I wanted to tag along to Agnieszka's question on the constitutional location of the ECB and its functions, going to the part of the mandate in Article 282.2 that is seldom remembered. So after price stability comes the clause that the ECB, without prejudice to price stability, must support the economic policies of the Union to attain the objectives of the European Union, which are on Article 3, the EU, so solidarity, cohesion, full employment, etc., etc. I would like to know if there is a great deal of intellectual dialogue inside the institution about how to go about pursuing that part of the mandate. Could it be with a fund such as the one that you are suggesting, which should act as a shock absorption fund, or should it be something even more granular than that, that would support the European Commission, for instance, in acting in regional policies of crisis, stabilization in post-crisis scenarios in parts of the Union, and or are there any other ideas? I have a little bit the concern that the ECB sees itself in that particular clause of its constitutional mandate as having only a supportive role and not being very proactive in terms of defining what should be the task, the mission of the ECB regarding the cohesion, solidarity and full employment objectives of the Union. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's not that easy when you start a new currency to give that new currency credibility, creditworthiness the world over in a very short span of time, and again, starting from scratch. Not easy. And we had to cope with various episodes with, as you know, some time when things were going quite smoothly and where you could consider, why don't you look at this, without prejudice to price stability? And I have to say, the example I can give, and it's true for my predecessor and for myself, was to say, don't forget that we were very bold. We engaged in a single currency endeavor that was never tried the world over. In this very bold endeavor, don't forget that you have to behave as in line as possible with this boldness. And I would put on the credit of the ECB, perhaps it is not exactly the response you were expecting, but the credit of the ECB to say, well, don't forget that the Stability and Growth Pact is part of the framework, even if it is not our responsibility. It's the responsibility, of course, of the governments concerned and of the Commission and of the Council. And I would say the same for the persistent imbalances I have been mentioning, which proved to be dramatic for our people, because all the prices that have been paid for letting without correction these imbalances for our own fellow citizens has been very, very dramatic. So I have to say we were very, very rarely in a situation which was so nice and so kind that we could concentrate on, I don't know, something like helping the structural funds or helping, but we were always, and perhaps in some editorial I already mentioned, considered to go much too far out of our mandate in the crisis. In my opinion, and I think it has been confirmed by the legal assessment of the Commission, legal assessment of the Council, of course legal assessment of the ECB, that what we were doing was in line with our mandate and in line with the treaty. And, but as you know, there has been trial and there has been strong criticism of the fact, and the ground was you went too far out of your primary mandate, and you took too much responsibility in the fighting against the crisis. To fight against the crisis means to help our fellow citizens in situations where, again, in my opinion, we could have had something like 2930s. So something which would have been even much more dramatic than what was already dramatic and we had to cope with. So again, I think we have to continue reflecting on that part of the treaty, and I hope very much that in the future we will be in a situation which would be much better. But I could list a number of initiatives which were taken, in particular, for instance, the fact that we give the possibility of the EIB to be refinanced in the ECB in my time, which you could say it's part of this understanding that we can go when we ensure price stability in some avenues that are part
kind of a wide interpretation of the
wider interpretation. No, not a wide interpretation. It's really the letter of the treaty, without, I would say, prejudice to price stability.
Mr.
Thank you. First of all, let me say it was a privilege sitting around the same table with President Trichet and trying to make the right decisions in a very difficult time. I have 3 questions, and forgive me. The first is 2 are for the past and 1 is for the future. The first is a what-if question. You, in discussing the crisis, you singled out the Deauville decision as, if I interpret you correctly, as what made debt restructuring in the case of Greece as pretty much inevitable. So the question is, what if the Deauville decision was never there? Would we have avoided the full systemic aspect of the crisis, meaning Ireland and Portugal, which came after Greece? Would we have avoided Greek debt restructuring, which you say was the one institutional failure? So that's my first question. The second question has to do with the criticism that we often hear, which is that the first Greek bailout was nothing else than bailing out German and French banks. So what would be your response to something that we hear very much as a criticism coming to the first package? And my question...
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got exactly the point.
One of the criticisms that many people make of the first bailout is that this was nothing less than nothing more than a bailout for French and German banks, which were loaded with Greek debt. And by bailing out Greece, basically one bailed out those banks by giving them the time to unload the debt before debt restructuring actually occurred. So a response to that. And my question about the future is, you expressed some skepticism about transfers, but there is a question in the new architecture that we're trying to build. What is, according to you, the role of joint debt issuance? What is the role of some version, there are many versions, of Eurobonds?
First question. Had we not had the Deauville Agreement, in my opinion, we had already the problem of Ireland and Portugal, because we intervened in Ireland and Portugal as soon as May 10, so before the Deauville Agreement, which came later. The Deauville Agreement, in my opinion, was aggravating the systemic problem. It would not have changed anything, in my opinion, on Greece. Greece was really a dramatic case, taking into account the starting point, the 15% I already mentioned, 15% for Greece, and the second ranking, I would say, problem along that indicator was Portugal with 10. So there is a difference between 15 and 10. And I take it that Greece would have been rescheduled or money would have been lost. But my understanding is that, again, we have finally treated Greece as a special case, and the other country could be rescued, and now everybody, including Greece, has access to market, if I'm not misled. Had we not had the Deauville Agreement, in my understanding, we would have probably avoided the drama of Spain and Italy in 2011, because the market had in mind that it was still in force, even if there had been some indication that it was only for new countries and not for old countries and so forth. But it was still troubling. So again, clear response to your question, Greece would have had the same treatment. Greece would still have been the Indonesia of the Asian crisis, as it's been. But again, we would have avoided triggering more turbulences in the systemic aspect of our very difficult problem. As regards the banks, I never read something which would be entirely convincing. But it's clear that the commitment which was taken by the private sector after the first help which was given at the beginning of 10, and particularly at the moment of the overall bailout of Greece, that commitment were not respected by the private sector. I don't think that it is only a question of German banks or French banks. I think it's more something which, for the future, will have to be looked after very, very carefully, that commitments were taken
What types of?
We will maintain our level of
exposure.
risk. Yeah.
But I think the first question wasn't the first Greek bailout tranche a way to help the French and German banks instead of Greek government, right?
Yeah,
the first
clear.
One
and it is to this question that I am responding as I do. They were committed to maintain exposure, and they did not maintain exposure. That's true, absolutely true. Third question on the future. Again, we already explored very much what would be an ideal EMU in the future. And as you see, I am both bold as regards the institutions and the changes, a Minister of Finance, an ESM which would be transformed, the Stabilization Fund, which could play a very important role. But I'm also very strong on meeting the present governance which exists. And I already noted that the Stability and Growth Pact is not understood as it should, namely something which is essential for the systemic stability of the area, and the MIP, which should be understood essential for the systemic stability of the area. And it seems to me that I was having great hopes in the MIP, and I don't see the Commission has determined to apply by the MIP rules. And I must confess also, it's true, the MIP is symmetric. And so we know, of course, that there is an implicit asymmetry because enormous systemic crisis problem can come out of the deficits, and you have no crisis drama, which is coming out of surpluses. Still, it is not because the surplus country are driving themselves, the deficit countries, the countries in deficit. It's not true because we are not a closed shop. The euro area is totally open to the rest of the world. So the problem is not that problem. The problem is how can you let the countries that have lost their competitiveness regain progressively their competitiveness if the costs in the countries that are highly competitive remain extremely well contained. To give an example which is arithmetically much too simple, if the best countries in terms of competitiveness with very big current account surplus, and I should not mention Germany alone, I mean, the Netherlands have a surplus of 10% of the GDP or something like that. So if these countries have not unit labor cost going higher than the average, how can you let the other countries regain their own competitiveness? A number of countries should do now exactly what Germany did after the start of the euro area, namely having unit labor cost growing much slower year after year after year than the average of the euro area. It is what gave Germany a fantastic competitive edge.
You're saying Germany should now have wages increase much higher than the euro area?
Not much higher,
but higher,
but everything must go smoothly.
So you're a big supporter,
but of course,
you're a big supporter of IG Metall.
Normally, I mean that depends on what they are asking for. I would prefer
they asked for 6 and they got 4, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, an augmentation of wages and salaries is good for everybody, in my opinion. A diminishing of the work of the number of hours worked is bad for everybody, in my opinion. So I'm very clear.
I don't know which country you're talking about.
I'm very clear. No, Germany also. But all taken into account, this is normal. I mean, we are supposed to oscillate in the long run around the average. We have the same currency. Nobody will regain competitiveness by any kind of devaluation of its own currency, depreciation of its own currency. So we have to accept, as we accepted since the very beginning, oscillation around the average in order for the average competitiveness of each particular entity, member of the euro area, to be in the long run at more or less at the same level. We are looking for full employment for all countries. We cannot look for some countries to be permanently in a dramatic situation in terms of cost competitiveness, in terms of competitiveness.
We're already way past our time, and I'm sorry, but we could go on obviously for a few more hours. Just before we go, because I'm sorry, we're in Italy, and I have to ask the question. So in August 2011, you wrote a letter to the then Prime Minister of Italy, demanding a very strong turnaround fiscal program. You'd been a big advocate of central bank independence for years, and now it seemed like it was interpreted, especially in Italy, as a big pressure of the ECB on the government to implement actual very detailed steps in economic policy. Pension reforms, I'm not talking just conforming with the Stability and Growth Pact. The letter was signed by your appointed successor and Governor of Bank of Italy at the time, yes. But wasn't that taking your role a bit too far with hindsight? And 3 months later, the Prime Minister was out. The causation, we will discuss. The euro nowadays, and again, I'm not saying this is linked or anything, is not popular in Italy. Latest Eurobarometer, 40% of Italians thinks it's a bad thing, against around 20-25% for the rest of the euro area. Wasn't that a bit heavy-footed pressure on the government for the ECB to do that at the time?
I can tell you that I wrote the same letter, of course.
To Ireland?
No, to Spain at the same time. Exactly at the same time. We were in a situation which I already mentioned, absolute drama after Greece, after Ireland and Portugal. We had Spain and Italy, which were heavily attacked by market, spreads skyrocketing, absence of appropriate financing of these economies. So we were the only game in town, the Governing Council of the ECB. We reflected on what to do. When I was speaking of 40% of the GDP of the euro area, it was more or less the case. We were at 37%. Spain, Italy, plus the countries that had already been in jeopardy because of the crisis. So we had a very, very important decision to take, not something that we would promise for the future, but to take immediately. Reactivate for Spain and Italy the SMP that we had already reactivated, by the way, for Italy and Portugal the week before, in order to be sure that the market understood that we were speaking for real and we were standing ready to intervene and stop this start of dramatic speculation, which was putting into question the transmission of our monetary policy to those countries and also, of course, the systemic stability of the Untitled. That being said, embarking the credibility of the ECB alone, again, because nobody else could intervene, against the entire rest of the world, if I may, because the market were dramatically negative, was something which was a very, very heavy decision to take. And as a responsible institution, putting its own credibility totally at risk in those circumstances, we estimated, and I estimated as the leader, but we estimated together with all colleagues, that we had to tell the government concerned what we were observing, which they knew, of course, as regards their own crisis, but what, in our opinion, could help restoring the famous creditworthiness that I was mentioning as the main goal, how to restore creditworthiness. And I had a phone call with both governments before sending the letter, telling them, don't be surprised, you will receive a letter. That letter will tell you as directly and frankly as possible how we see things, seen from the ultimate goal, which is to regain creditworthiness as soon as possible. This letter is, in our eyes, secret, and you are the owner of the letter. And I don't want to negotiate anything with you. I didn't tell them we are about to intervene massively on Monday morning. And all this took place in a weekend. But we will observe very, very carefully what happens and so forth. And it was totally dramatic. It's true that with the benefit of the hindsight, it appears extraordinary, not only that we send those letters, but that in the circumstances where we were the only institution able to help immediately the prime ministers concerned, namely Mr. Zapatero and Mr. Berlusconi, received the letter, meditated, and took action, including in Italy, where there was an extraordinary meeting of the National Assembly in the month of August, which was totally extraordinary. With the benefit of the hindsight, now the letters were made public by the addressees, both Mr. Berlusconi and Mr. Zapatero. This is part of history. I think that as extraordinary as it might be and appear to be right now, I don't see how we could have put, again, as I said, our own authority and credibility at risk. And the risk was that we would be beaten by the market. And fancy what is the credibility of the central bank, which engage in a counter-speculation and is beaten by the market in its own counter-speculation, where everybody would have seen that we had lost the battle. So I think, and again, you ask me, do you regret something? I would say in that particular case, I ne regrette rien. Non, je ne regrette rien.
I think that will be our final word. Thank you very much, Jean-Claude Trichet, for having been with us. That